All right, today we're going to cover emotion. And so the outline that we'll go over today includes, first we'll talk about the basic emotions. Then we'll talk about how you measure and you can manipulate emotion in the lab. Then we'll go over emotion and how it interacts with attention and memory. And then we'll talk about what neural structures are involved in processing emotion in the brain. And we'll go over the role of the amygdala in fear processing, as well as other regions and other types of emotions. Okay, so what is emotion? Take a second to write down your response. And I know that many of you already have an intuition for what emotion is, but in order to try to understand how you can study the neural processing that helps us have emotions, we have to think about how to better define what an emotion is. So take a second to think about that. Okay, so emotion is a subjective, conscious experience, and it is a brief response to an internal or an external event. And it involves facial expressions, biological reactions, like you might be sweating. It also involves mental states. And it's linked to the arousal of the nervous system. And what we usually think of when we think of emotion are feelings, and that is the subjective representation of emotion. It's how we feel about emotion, about what we are experiencing. And emotions are different than moods, which are more of a diffuse state, and they are longer and less intense than emotions. So emotions are brief, whereas moods are longer and they're usually less intense. An affect is a broad term for emotion and feeling and mood. So broadly, what we call the study of emotion in terms of its cognitive neuroscience is affective neuroscience. Okay, so what are some basic emotions? Darwin in 1859 proposed a limited number of basic universal human emotions. So he said that all humans, no matter what their culture, what their upbringing, whatever their language, they all have these basic emotions. And Ekman in 1971 found evidence for what he thought were 6 basic emotional expressions that people had. So that was anger, disgust, fear, happiness, and sadness. And the question is, can you think of any more? So here are and as well as surprise. So here are the facial expressions that are very commonly used, especially in his papers, but these faces very well portray these 6 different emotions that he was talking about. But as you've clearly seen a hint throughout, there might be there might be other emotions that you can think of that are not exactly covered by these 6 basic emotions, right? So perhaps like anger and disgust might equal contempt, right? And importantly, these 6 emotional expressions are very universal. And what Ekman was claiming, and what I think is still true to this day, is how we convey these emotions through facial expression doesn't really vary from culture to culture. Some cultures may put lots of importance in trying to mask different types of emotions, but if they are allowed to be freely expressed, these are the facial expressions that we usually make when we feel these different things, when we have these different emotions. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do something, and you can put the answers again on the little text box below. So can you match these faces to the emotional expressions? Anger, which one is anger? Which one is disgust? Which one is fear? Happiness? sadness, and surprise. Now, I'm sure that almost all of you have gotten all of these correct, and that is because these expressions really truly seem to be quite universal. Some people make some errors with surprise, but we usually get all of these quite correctly. So you might be asking yourself, well, are there other emotions? I think there most certainly are. There might be amusement, right? Contentment. There was even contempt, right, in the previous slide. Boredom, embarrassment, shame, pride, confusion, and so on. There's such a rich variety of different emotions that humans have. And then I was also curious, and I wanted to see, well, has anyone, what's the weirdest sort of emotion that humans could possibly feel? And Google told me that the answer to that is probably opia. So this is the name that's given to the intense feeling of invasive arousal that one feels when engaging in mutual gaze, making direct eye contact with someone else. So I think a lot of us can think that is a emotion that perhaps that we felt at some point. But yeah, that's a weird one. And it just illustrates that there's a huge variety of different emotions that humans have. And maybe they're not simply constrained to these 6 basic emotions. And there's research from OSU that suggests that even though those 6 basic ones are quite universal, there might be more emotions that are conveyed through facial expressions. So for instance, researchers at OSU found a way for computers to recognize 21 distinct facial expressions, even expressions for complex or seemingly contradictory emotions. The study gives cognitive scientists more tools to study the origins of emotion in the brain. Here, a study participant makes 3 faces: happy, disgusted, and happily disgusted. So you might think that these, that happy and disgust are quite dissimilar, but here is a facial expression that that conveys happily disgusted. And so here are the 21 facial expressions. And so they're calling them basic to compound emotion categories. So compound because they are composed of multiple basic emotions. So there's happy, sad, fearful, surprised, fearful, happy, sad, fearful, angry, surprised, disgusted, happily surprised, happily disgusted, sadly fearful, sadly angry, and so on. And the last one is odd. So you might be wondering, well, how do they know? Like, how did they figure out that there were these different types of emotions that can be conveyed? Well, let's think about how we can measure and manipulate emotion in the lab. One way that, that researchers have done this is by trying to outline the dimensions of emotion. And they used a multidimensional scaling approach to classify emotions. And so they had people rate different types of emotions in terms of what that different facial expression had them convey, for instance. And then they found that they could organize these different emotions along 2 basic dimensions. So the first dimension was that of valence, how negative or positive a particular emotion was. So it goes from pleasant to unpleasant. So positive to negative valence. And then the second dimension that helps to explain almost all of these different emotions is arousal. So how intense is your reaction to the emotion? So there's activation, so high arousal, and then deactivation, low arousal. So if we think about it, let's take happy, so that's a positive valence, and it's kind of it's a more activated arousal. And then elated is even more arousing than happy. And then if you're excited, that's probably the peak of the most aroused you are in terms of how intense that reaction is. And then it's also quite positive. And then let's go in the opposite direction. So if something is unpleasant along this side of the valence, negative valence things include tense, stressed, and then upset is a little bit less intense of a emotion. And then going down even further, there's sad, depressed, fatigued. Fatigue is sort of the lowest, the most negative intensity of the different unpleasant emotions that you could have. So overall, all of these different types of emotions, pretty much anything, any type of emotion that you can think of can be categorized in terms of either positive or negative valence, or high arousal or low arousal. And I encourage you to think about some different types of emotions that you might have and try to, that are not along this circle, and think about where they would fit in terms of where they are in terms of valence and arousal. All right. What is the best way to measure emotion in the lab? So one way, we're testing humans. You might just ask them directly, right? Self-report. Tell me how this makes you feel. You could also have a direct assessment. So participants explicitly report their emotional reaction, mood, or attitude towards something. So you give them a task to do, or you give them a stimulus, and then they tell you how that makes them feel. And so I want you to think about whether there are any drawbacks to this direct approach. So think about it and then write it down. So what are some challenges and drawbacks to direct reports of emotion? So to overcome these potential challenges of measuring emotion directly, there are definitely ways to measure it indirectly. And so you could do an indirect assessment. You could give an individual a stimulus and say, which one do you like more, happy face or a sad face? And the underlying assumption is that the emotion will influence the choice that you make between these two stimuli. You could also see, you could look at inhibition or facilitation of a behavior. So you could look at, does this particular manipulation increase or decrease reaction time? Does it, how do your eye movements, how do you look at the stimulus? Are your eye movements different when a face is happy versus sad, for instance? You could also use psychophysiology, like looking at skin conductance, which is which measures the autonomic nervous system's arousal. So you sweat when you look at something that's either like exciting or that makes you nervous. And so through that, we can glean how a stimulus makes an individual feel.